أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. I asked for the fans, and it looks like the one fan that's not working is this one right here. All right. All right, so yesterday we began speaking about this topic of priorities. To recap very quickly, we talked about the idea that we should prioritize living with the full understanding that death is a necessary part of life, and that what we really should prioritize is not avoiding death and fleeing from death, but rather dying well. Right? And then we talked about some of the problems with the current situation that we have, the way that the healthcare system works. It is not very conducive to this kind of dying. And you end up dying in a way that's very chaotic, very much in a way that prevents you from being able to reflect as one who's dying, and that the family also is not able to have a meaningful end to the person's life. I shared a couple of ahadith with you yesterday that showed us some of the ways that the Prophet himself would interact with people when they're on their deathbed. The way he would visit them, the priorities that he had, not to focus on saving the person's life, but rather on reminding them of their beliefs, teaching them du'as, helping them to seek forgiveness for themselves, and reminding them really of what's most important, not to save their life, but to save their soul. I want to share a couple more hadith with you. This one is also from Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. قال الصادق عليه السلام اعتقل لسان رجل من أهل المدينة فدخل عليه رسول الله. So he narrates the story from the time of the Messenger of Allah and says that there was this man on his deathbed who was no longer able to speak. Right? So he's at a point where he's tongue-tied and his faculty of speech is no longer working. So he can't say the shahadatain, he can't say these things, and so the Prophet goes to him. And he says, قُلْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ فَلَمْ يَقْدِرْ عَلَيْهِ. When he tells the person to say the shahadatain, he's not able to say anything. Now, of course, we know that that's not important. If a person can't speak, then of course Allah knows what's in their heart and they can say it in their heart. That's not a problem. But the Prophet diagnoses that the reason he can't speak is not some sort of impediment. It's not a physical impediment. He was able to speak before. He diagnosed that there's something wrong with the person, that he's not able to say this at this critical moment as he's dying. Right? There's something, like the other person had certain sins that were causing that blackness to come, and the blackness was there before the whiteness, in the hadith we read yesterday. And so the Prophet diagnoses that the problem is certain sins, and he tells the person to do istighfar, to seek forgiveness, and when he does that, then the whiteness and the darkness, they switch places, and now the whiteness comes to him first before the blackness. Right? So similarly, in this situation, he recognizes that there's something wrong on a spiritual level that's preventing the person from talking. فَأَعَادَ عَلَيْهِ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ فَلَمْ يَقْدِرْ عَلَيْهِ. Again, the Prophet tells him, say La ilaha illallah, still he's not able to. وَعِنْدَ رَأْسِ الرَّجُلِ إِمْرَأَةٌ فَقَالَ لَهَا هَلْ لِهَذَا الرَّجُلِ So the Prophet sees that at the head of the deathbed of this person, there is a woman standing there, an elderly woman, and he doesn't know the person, so he asks the woman, does this man have a mother who's still alive? So the woman says, نعم يا رسول الله أنا أمه, I'm his mother. فقال لها أفراضية أنت عنه أم لا. So the Prophet's question to her, again, he's not consoling her, he's not comforting, he's focusing on what the real problem is. He says, are you pleased with your son or not? Right? Are you pleased with your son or not? فقالت لا. She says, no, I'm not. I'm upset with him. بل ساخطة. فقال لها رسول الله فإني أحب أن ترضى عنه. So the Prophet says, I request you, I would like for you to forego whatever has made you upset and make yourself pleased with him. Right? Forgive him for whatever he's done and be happy with him at this moment. Right? Because if you're not, then the concept, it might be a minor thing relatively, maybe he showed disrespect, maybe he did something, but now at this critical moment, if you're upset with him and he dies like that, then he's lost. Right? So yeah, he says that for my sake at least, I would love for you to be pleased with him and forego whatever he's done to make you upset. فَقَالَ لَهَا, so she says, قَدْ رَضِيتُ عَنْهُ لِرِضَاكَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. So she says, for your sake, because you're asking, I'll forego everything and I'll be pleased with him and no longer displeased. فَقَالَ لَهُ قُلْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ فَقَالَ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Now the person was able to speak. Right? With his mother now happy with him, that one barrier was lifted and the person is able to say the shahada. قُلْ يَا مَنْ يَقْبَلُ الْيَسِيرِ وَيَعْفُ عَنِ الْكَثِيرِ اقْبَلْ مِنِّ الْيَسِيرِ وَاعْفُ عَنِّ الْكَثِيرِ إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ الْعَفُوُّ الْغَفُورِ. So the Prophet tells the man who's dying to recite this dua, similar to the one we read yesterday. Oh Allah, forgive me for the many sins I've committed and accept the few good deeds that I've done, O you who are all forgiving and all foregoing. فَقَالَهَا فَقَالَ لَهُ مَاذَا تَرَى. So the person says the dua, repeats after the Prophet, and the Prophet asks him, what do you see now? What kinds of visions are you seeing? So the person says, أَرَى أَسْوَدَيْنِ قَدْ دَخَلَ عَلَيَّ. He says that I see two black things, two black kind of colors that are closing in on me. Right? And this, remember I said yesterday that hadith from Imam Sadiq says that أَعْقَلُ مَا يَكُونُ الْمُؤْمِنِ عِنْدَ مَوْتِهِ. That the time when you see the clearest, when you're the most lucid, is at the time of death. Contrary to what we usually think people who are dying are out of it, and even like Umar ibn Khattab said about the Prophet, in the rajul la yahjur, he's speaking nonsense about the Prophet because he's in his last throes of death, right? So that was his evaluation, that the Prophet's, he's speaking nonsense at this point, when in reality, even a regular person at that point, that's when they're most lucid. Not in a way that they can communicate, but in terms of seeing reality, they can see the reality the most at that point. They can see angels, they can see death coming, these sorts of things. فَأَعَادَهَا. So the person again says the dua, فَقَالَ مَا تَرَى. Now what do you see? Then he said, قَدْ تَبَاعَدَ عَنِّي وَدَخَلَ أَبْيَضَانِ وَخَرَجَ الْأَسْوَدَانِ. So now the Prophet tells the Prophet to say the dua again, seek forgiveness again. He says it again, and now he says that things have changed. Now I see the darkness is moving away, and two white figures are now closing in on me and coming closer to me. And then he said, so the Prophet interprets the vision for him, tells him that this is good. He tells the mother also that he's in a good situation. Because of your forgiveness of him, he's now going to die well, and the person dies pretty shortly after that. So again, you just see the priorities of the Prophet, right? What he's focused on with this person. Arguably, you could say, well, they didn't have technology, they didn't have the advancement of technology to be able to cure the person. They had medicine of some sort. They did have people who were specialists in health and healthcare. So it's not that, we'll talk about this a little later. I know that concern is also probably in your heads from yesterday's talk. Am I advocating that we should forego medicine and basically, just whenever death is about to come or potentially going to come, just die and not try to save health and not try to restore health? Absolutely not. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but let's go through the hadith first. Another hadith from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, عن أبي عبد الله عليه السلام قال: إذا عسر على الميت موته ونزعه قرب إلى مصلاه الذي كان يصلي فيه. So one of the other tactics, one of the other practices that the Ahlul Bayt would employ was to take the person who's dying and having a hard time dying, right? Who's struggling to die, who's suffering towards the end. Again, instead of thinking about how can we save his life and making that the focus, he's focused on how can we make his death easier. Right? So one of the practices they had was to take the person to the place where he normally prayed. So this can happen in two ways. Sometimes I don't know, in your house you might have a particular place where you usually pray. You might have a particular janamaz that's yours, a particular sajjada that's yours. You might have a particular place that you pray. The way I picture it in their time, because they had a very good and strong habit of praying in the masjid. Right, this is another priority that we need to talk about at another time, of living close and not having these huge commutes and huge distances that typically in these kinds of communities you have, where you're driving hours, and half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour just to get to the masjid. Of course, that's not practical. You're never going to be able to make daily prayers in that situation. So it's got to be a situation where you prioritize living close to the masjid over other things, so that you can then have that sort of contact, which is an ideal. It is something we're supposed to aspire to. Living close to a masjid, working close to a masjid, arranging your life in such a way that doesn't have to be this masjid. It doesn't mean you have to move to this one. But have a local masjid. Either move close to one or build one close to yourself. Those are our two options. Right? Not to always pray at home and really have, as an exception, going to the masjid. So in those times, people would pray their jama'ah prayer, their wajib prayers in jama'ah in the masjid, but they would also have their own musalla at home, their own place of prayer at home. So for Salatul Layl, for instance, right, they would have in one corner, maybe in your bedroom or something like that, you would have your place of prayer. And so it was recommended then, Imam Sadiq says, if a person is having a hard time dying, then take him into that place where he usually prays, or to bring a sajada and put it under him, put it over him. So now he has that contact with that kind of setting, that place where he was closest to Allah, where his soul was most sublime, and where he had the least connection to the dunya. And then giving up his soul will be that much easier for him. Yeah, so this is a recommendation even for us. If you go to, if you're in a situation where you have a relative who's dying, who's in the hospital, right? These are the kinds of things to think about. Ihtidar that we talked about yesterday, right? So you point the person in the right direction with the feet towards the qibla. Remind them of these basic beliefs. Remind them of the shahadatain. If they haven't said their last prayer, get them to do wudu and say their prayers. If they can't do wudu, do it for them. Do tayammum for them. Right? Learn the rules for how to do that. You can actually, if you can take their hands and you move their hands. You move their hands, get them to do tayammum, and then move their hands over their forehead and their hands to do tayammum for them. And then if they're conscious enough to pray, get them to pray. Whatever they're doing, however they are, they don't have to move. You just let them say whatever they can. If they can't do anything, they can move their eyes. They can do ruku' like this and sujood like that. Right? But if they have a prayer that's still wajib on them, then get them to say that prayer. Yeah. So these are the kinds of things we should be thinking about. Put them on the musalla, bring their sajjada close to them so they can die in a better way, in an easier way. قال علي بن الحسين إن أبا سعيد الخدري كان من أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وكان مستقيما فنزع 3 أيام فغسله أهله ثم حمل إلى مصلاه فمات فيه. So quite a few traditions in this one section, they talk about, so this is Imam Sajjad speaking, but he's referring back to Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. So Abu Sa'id was one of the outstanding companions of the Prophet, one of his Hawariyin, one of the people who stood by Imam Ali, didn't give his bay'ah right away, and these kinds of things. So he's a really outstanding person. Unfortunately, rarely spoken about in our gatherings. So sometimes as a side note, we do injustice to all the companions of the Prophet. If you read Sahifa Sajjadiyah, the third or the fourth dua, I think it's the fourth dua, is a dua for the companions of the Prophet. All prophets in general, but particular our Prophet. Right? And as Shia, we've only focused on, like when we say companions, we think of those companions who betrayed the Prophet, and that's kind of what comes to our mind first. So we think companions, oh, they're bad. And then that's the characteristic, that's how we're characterized as well. Our Sunni friends and Sunni colleagues, they'll say, oh, the Shia, they're the ones who hate the companions of the Prophet. And that is a serious thing. If we have that blanket sort of a generalization of all the companions, that's unjust, that's wrong. These were outstanding individuals. There were some bad apples amongst them, the ones who did bad things. There were munafiqeen amongst them, and there are people who obviously betrayed his trust. But they're the minority. Right? The majority of the companions, they were amazing people, and it's thanks to them that everything turned out the way it did. And the Prophet, the Imam, They can't do anything on their own. They're not leaders by force, they're not dictators. They can only lead if they have followers. They need those supporters, they need those people who are going to do the actual work for them. Be on the battlefield and fight those battles alongside with them, support them. Right? And so these are the people who did that, these companions of them. So Abu Sa'id is one of those. So the tradition that Imam Zayn al-Abidin, he mentions that during his death, it took him 3 days to die. Right? So for 3 days he was in the throes of death and really suffering and these kinds of things. And finally, the family, it doesn't say exactly what the mechanism was. Maybe they remembered this teaching of the Prophet, or the Imam told him or whatever, that this was the practice. So they end up taking him to his musalla, the place of prayer, and then he's able to die very easily. So he was struggling to die, and they made it easier by taking him to his musalla. Another hadith says, كنا عند أبي عبد الله عليه السلام فقال له الرجل إن أخي منذ 3 أيام في النازع وقد اشتد عليه الأمر فادعوا له. So a person comes to the 6th Imam and he says that my brother has been on his deathbed for 3 days and he hasn't been able to die. He's suffering and he hasn't been able to die. So please offer a prayer for him. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So the Prophet immediately turns around and says, Allahumma sahil alayhi sakarat al-maut. He makes the dua, Allah make the pains of death, the pangs of death, the throes of death easy for him. And the term sakarat al-maut is also very interesting. It comes in Surah Qaf in the Quran. Right? So the sakarat al-maut, sakra, you might know the term sakran, for instance. وَتَرَى النَّاسَ سُكَارَى وَمَا هُمْ بِسُكَارَى وَلَكِنَّ عَذَابَ اللَّهِ شَدِيدٌ. Surah Al-Hajj, in the beginning it talks about the events of the Day of Judgment as things are being destroyed and earthquakes and all these things are happening. You'll see the man who is not drunk walk like a drunkard, back and forth like this, wobbling because of the earth shaking underneath him. Right? So it'll seem like he's drunk when he's not actually drunk because of that. So sakra has to do with drunkenness, intoxication. So the term that's used for the pangs of death is also the same. Sakaratul maut are these pains that you feel as you're trying to give up your soul. Right? So sometimes I think we assume that if the person is quiet and the face is calm, that means they're having a peaceful death. That's a baseless assumption. Right? The physical features don't reflect what the person is actually going through. Right? The removal of the soul is something different. It's a scary thing, and it should be a scary thing, but it's not necessarily a terrible thing to anticipate the pains of death. There is one hadith from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, in which he says that one of the manifestations of Allah's mercy on the believers is that He allows them to atone for their sins before the Day of Judgment. Right? So definitely, we've all done things that for which we deserve punishment. If Allah is to be just with us, then we'll really suffer. So what He does for those who are really trying to be on the right path, who are believers, He tries to set up situations within our life and in the process of death and in the grave and early on in the Day of Judgment, so that we can atone for those sins and at those stages, and we don't have to face anything finally in terms of hellfire. So for that reason, sometimes you'll see believers suffer more than non-believers. You'll see, for instance, the pain of death, the sakaratul maut, that's one of the ways. And so the person will suffer in that way, even though they're believers. In fact, because they're believers, they'll suffer at death, but then they're done. Then they're expiated. Or if they still have something left, then in the grave they'll be punished. And then they're expiated. If they still have something left, then on the Day of Judgment, before the actual judgment, in terms of thirst and hunger, and in terms of the heat and all those other kinds of things that are to which people are subjected, they'll suffer in those areas. But when they finally get the judgment, then they'll be clean. They'll be purged of all of the sins and all the effects of those sins. So it may not sound very merciful, because as punishment, But it's merciful when you consider a temporary and relatively minor punishment versus eternal damnation, versus any aspect of hellfire. Or there's one hadith that says that if even a drop of hellfire were to enter into this realm, into this dunya, it would burn up everything. So we don't want to play games with it and say, I'll deal with hellfire for a little bit and then I'll be free. Right? A little bit of hellfire is nothing to joke about. Right? We don't want to even come close to it, even touch it, if we can. And we have full control over that. This is another one of those areas where we have full control and we relinquish control. Right? We have full control over our position in the hereafter. That's what our free will is about. We have full control over where we end up in the hereafter. But we say, Allah knows best. Of course He knows best, but that doesn't mean we can throw up our hands and say, let Him decide. Let's decide ourselves by living a life that's worthy of His forgiveness and worthy of the shafa'ah of the Ahlul Bayt, so that whatever slip-ups we have, those will be forgiven. In tajtanibu kaba'ir al-ithmi wal-fawahisha. What is that rest of the verse? I just forgot the verse. In tajtanibu kaba'ir al-ithmi wal-fawahish yukaffir ankum sayyi'atikum. Yeah, so if we focus on avoiding the major sins, right, those really terrible things, focus on those at least, and we're good at staying away from the major stuff, the light stuff he'll wipe clean. There's still sins, we still deserve punishment for them, but out of His grace, he'll forgo the rest. He'll do takfir of the rest. Takfir, not the takfir of ISIS. Right? Takfir here means to cover, to conceal, to wipe away. Right? So the Prophet makes the dua for the person, "Oh Allah, make the pain of death easy for him." Then he says, "Hawwilu firashahu ila musalla alladhi kana yusalli fi." Then he instructs them that you should take him and put him where he used to pray. Let's move his bed there. Let's lift him up and put him there. فَإِنَّهُ يُخَفَّفُ عَلَيْهِ إِنْ كَانَ فِي أَجَلِهِ تَأْخِيرٌ. He says that this is a practice that will make it easier for him. It'll make it an easier process if he's having some hardship. قَدْ حَضَرَتْ فَإِنَّهُ يُسَهِّلُ عَلَيْهِ إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهِ. So if Allah wills, it'll make it easy for him. All right, two more hadith. Actually, it's one more hadith. So another recommendation that they have is to read Surah As-Saffat. A lot of times people wonder what to do. You go to the hospital, someone's dying, or you're next to your grandparents or your relative or a community member who's passing away, and you kind of feel awkward. You don't know what to do. We have prescriptions of what to do. We don't have to make up our own formulas and read this that many times and that many times. And we have du'as from the Ahlul Bayt. These are the things to do. We have these talqeens that we're supposed to be reading to them. So read these to them. It gives you something to do that focuses you on the right stuff. It helps focus them on the right stuff. And Surah As-Saffat, not any random part of the Quran, but this particular surah, again, it helps that person to die easier. Right? So with the Quran, we know that the Quran is guidance, and that's definitely the important aspect of it. But there are also sometimes other sorts of effects of the surahs or certain verses that we would never access ourselves. We would never be able to know these things ourselves, but only because the Ahlul Bayt tell us that there are these certain secrets in the Quran, other than the guidance that we get, then based on their revelations of these secrets, then we can avail ourselves of those too. One interesting one is there's one verse, I call it the alarm clock verse. Anybody know what that is? There's a verse where if you read it, it helps you to wake up. Right, so the very last verse of Surah Al-Kahf. Yeah, as part of your bedtime routine, recite this last verse. قُلْ إِنَّمَا أَنَا بَشَرٌ مِثْلُكُمْ يُوحَى إِلَيَّ أَنَّمَا إِلَهُكُمْ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ فَمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو لِقَاءَ رَبِّهِ فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا. Read that verse, and the hadith say, when you read the verse, make your intention for when you want to wake up, for Fajr, for Salatul Layl, for work, whatever it is that you want to wake up for, and this will help you to wake up. Right? If you do it correctly, and of course you have to do your part as well. So if you sleep extremely late and you eat a huge heavy meal and those kinds of things, and then you sleep, nothing's going to help you. Right? Even a big cup of coffee is not going to help you to get up. Right? So the verse is not magic. Like with any dua, any of these things, you do this, but you also have to do the rest of your homework and make sure you put everything else in place. So sleep early, arrange everything else, but then you read this verse and it helps you to wake up on time. Yeah, so this particular surah, there's this one hadith where this is from a companion. It's probably the 7th Imam. So Abu Hassan, we have a few of them. Abu Hassan, of course, Imam Ali, he's never referred to as Abu Hassan in a hadith. He's always Amir al-Mu'mineen and sometimes Abu Hassan as well. But Abu Hassan is usually the 7th Imam or the 8th Imam, and sometimes we refer to the 10th Imam as well, Imam Ali al-Hadi. So this is probably the 7th Imam. رأيت أبا الحسن عليه السلام يقول لابنه القاسم قم يا بني فقرأ عند رأس أخيك والصافات صفا حتى تستتمها. So the Imam tells one of his sons to get up and read Surah Al-Safat near the bed of his brother who's passing away. Right? And completely read the surah from beginning to end. فقرأ فلما بلغ هم أشد خلقا أمن خلقنا. When he reaches this verse, قضى الفتى. He reaches this verse and his brother dies. فلما سجي وخرجوا أقبل عليه يعقوب بن جعفر فقال له كنا نعهد الميت إذا نزل به الموت يقرأ عنده ياسين والقرآن الحكيم فصرت تأمرنا بالصافات. So one of the companions, after seeing all of this, seeing the Imam instruct the son to read Safat for the other son, he says, I'm confused because in the past, our habit, so whatever we thought we were supposed to, we used to read Yasin and thought Yasin would help the person to die. But now I see that you've commanded your son to say Safat instead. So he's asking, which one's right? Is this some new ruling or what? فقال يا بني لم تقرأ عند مكروب من موت قط إلا عجل الله راحته. So he says that the benefit of Surah Safat is that whenever it's read near someone who is dying, then Allah makes their death very easy and puts them at ease and helps them to die in an easy way. Alright, so it's a very different message, I think. Right? So hopefully it's a paradigm shift in terms of thinking of death and thinking about what we should be focused on at that critical time in our life, as part of our life, and it's that necessary step that's going to take us to the next. Now, does all this mean that we forego medical care? So absolutely not. We have this struggle, I think, in many instances, in many areas of life. The whole concept of tawakkul, right? One of the common misconceptions of tawakkul is trust in Allah, relying on Allah, kind of making Him our wakil, making Him our agent, by turning our affairs over to Him. So you might think that doing tawakkul would mean simply like throwing my hands up and saying, Allah, you take care of it. I have nothing to do with it, you take care of it. That sounds really good. It sounds like, in a romantic way, it sounds like you're really trusting in Allah, you're relying on His power, and so you're not even going to do anything yourself, and you're just relying on Him. But that's a twisted way of thinking about our relationship with Allah and the way He works. يَأْبَى اللَّهُ أَن يُجْرِيَ الْأُمُورِ إِلَّا بِالْأَسْبَابِ. The hadith says that Allah doesn't like to do things without their proper channels, without the proper processes. He does. Of course, He can do anything, and He does do miracles. Miracles are suspensions of those normal processes and shortcuts for some purpose. But that's not a normal thing at all. He normally likes for things to unfold on their own through the normal channels. And so while He could provide for you and me the way He provided for Lady Mary, peace be upon her, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَرْزُقُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ, she says. She tells Prophet Zakaria, when he asks her, أَنَّا لَكِ هَذَا, where did you get all this food from? And the hadith say that she used to have winter fruit in the summer and summer fruit in the winter, which is no miracle now because the grocery stores will ship stuff from South America during their summer and give it to us in the winter. But at that time it was a miracle. Right? And so she says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَرْزُقُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ. Allah provides for whomever He wishes without any sort of accounting. If He wants, He can. So He can provide that for all of us if He wanted to, but the purpose wouldn't be served. His purpose is not to provide for us in that way where we become accustomed to receiving things. Lady Mary was an exception. She was in a position, she was a kind of a person who didn't take advantage of this. Because Allah provided for her, she didn't become lazy and decide that, okay, if He's going to provide, I'm just going to sleep all day and not do anything. Right? This gave her the opportunity to do what she wanted to do most, which was worship. So she could devote herself fully to worship and fully to study and all the other things that she did in her cloister within the temple of Prophet Dawood. And so for someone like that who's exceptional, this kind of favor of Allah doesn't corrupt them. But for the rest of us, imagine if we got everything free, you didn't have to go to work, you didn't have to even wake up at any certain hour, everything's provided for you, then what motivation would you have to do the things that you do, to have the kinds of activities that you have, and what would we end up as? What kind of mental faculties would we have? What kind of physical shape would we be in? It's at very least, if we have even no motivation or inspiration to do our work, at very least we know that we have a responsibility to take care of ourselves and take care of our family. So at very least that motivates us to get up and go to work every day. So while Allah could provide for us in a miraculous way, He chooses not to because it's not in our best interest. And so He makes us do these things, go through these steps, work and expend effort, expend time, and then that leads to eventually a paycheck, and that leads eventually to a grocery store, and eventually to cooking the food, and you have your food and your sustenance. So this is the way Allah works. When He tells us to trust in Him, He's not trying to encourage us to stop availing ourselves of these means and to say, oh Allah, you provide for me, I'm not going to do anything. The tawakkul ala Allah is really a paradigm. It's really a way of thinking about things more than an actual change in how you do things. So if I trust in Allah, I understand that my sustenance does not come from my work. I'm not the one who got this job for myself. I'm not the one who gets my paycheck and makes money. I don't make money. I don't grow my own food. I don't harvest my own food. I don't do any of that stuff. I'm basically like an agent. Allah is the one who provides everything. And my role in that formula between His giving and my receiving is to really fulfill certain prerequisites that He has put there, without which He's not going to provide for me. So we have a hadith that say your rizq is madmoon. Your sustenance is guaranteed. But we understand that guarantee is not the kind of guarantee that we might think that I can sit down and do nothing and it'll still come. It's a guarantee that's conditional, it's contingent upon me doing certain things to then open those gates for Allah to provide for me. So I have a role of fulfilling these prerequisites. I must fulfill the prerequisites, otherwise it won't come. And the prerequisites are not always only work. Sometimes it's a paid job that you have to do, sometimes you have other obligations. And in textbooks they always talk about jihad, for instance. At the time when jihad was something that was there, people would have to leave everything, leave their livelihood, leave their business, and if the Prophet called for a jihad, they would put everything down and go to the battlefield ready to die, because the Prophet has said that this is something I have to do. Without any care for kids and wife and business and all those things, this was their primary concern. That's one of the reasons why the institution of booty and ghanima came in. Right? So that the soldier, having sacrificed so much and putting his life on the line literally for the sake of Islam, he should have this reward as well, that if he does win, if he's successful, then they get 4/5 of whatever's left on the battlefield by the enemy. Right? So this is our understanding of tawakkul, not that we ignore the means of Allah, but rather we avail of ourselves of those means. Tawakkul comes in when I understand that those means are from Allah and not alongside Allah. If I start to think that my money is what feeds me, my money is what supports me, my pocketbook is the source of my sustenance, that becomes shirk. And then when I run out of money, when I'm low on funds, then I say, oh Allah, give me sustenance. Because now my pocketbook's not sufficient anymore, so now I need Allah's help. As though He's another my one God didn't work, so now I have to go to another God. That's the kind of conception that boils down to. But if my conception is no, that my money, my job, all these different things that I think of as my source of sustenance, these are simply means through which Allah provides me with whatever I need, that's the right attitude, the right understanding of the system, and that leads to tawakkul. So I trust in Allah. That doesn't mean that I don't do anything. Rather, I still go to my work every day. I still work hard. I still do the best I can. But I understand that my work is not what gives me money. Allah gives me money. Allah provides for whatever He thinks I need. All I have to do is fulfill my obligation. Right? And so when it comes to life and death, it's the same thing. Right? On the one hand, we are able to use all of these means of scientific advancement and technology, medical advancement to have a significant effect on our lives and our health, and even we have life-saving technology. So absolutely, no rational person would say we should forego that, and that's somehow in keeping with tawakkul ala Allah. That's foolishness. If we turn away from the means that Allah has put at our disposal, that is primarily ingratitude to Allah for providing us with those things. It's like having a plate in front of you of food and refusing to eat it and then dying of starvation. It's just silly. Of course no one would do that. And no one would think to blame Allah and say, Allah, why didn't you provide for me? I was waiting for you to send some miraculous food down. I didn't want this normal food. Right? Obviously that's foolish. So the same thing goes for this, that we shouldn't ignore the things that we have, and we shouldn't refrain from advancing our technology and working more on these kinds of things. All of that is normal human activity that is good, and it can be part of our religious obligation as well, as we try to do more and more to improve the lives of humans and reduce suffering and these kinds of things. So if we do these things for the right reasons and for Allah's purpose and to help people to reduce suffering, and it becomes a very noble act, an act that even Allah would reward. What I'm advocating for is not to abandon medicine, but rather just to change our perspective, to realize what place the medical help takes and what the priority is. That the priority is not with saving life at all cost, but rather within some other sort of a framework, under reasonable circumstances where there's a chance that the person can live, and it's is a kind of a clear process where this person can be taken over this one hurdle, and then once that is solved, then everything else will work and the person can continue to live. That would be a clear place where the medical procedures would be perfectly in order. But on the other hand, we should recognize that death is reality. It very well could be this person's about to die, and make sure that that's accounted for in the process of the medical services as well. Right? So it shouldn't be that those two scenarios I gave yesterday, that the medical services come in and they push everyone out, and now no family, no one to remind the person, no one to do all of these things for that person are there, and then finally when he's dead, then they say, okay, now you can come say goodbye. Now you can come say whatever prayers you want to say, when the person's already dead. For all those reasons I mentioned yesterday, for the family and for the person, it's not just, it's not the right thing to do. All right. Recite with salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. How to make the change? Perhaps it's in your, the ball's in your court. Those of you who have positions, those of you who are in the field. My job was to help you to change your perspective a little bit. Think of this other priority. How you can apply that, that's a different question. On an individual basis, certainly there are things that we can do in terms of writing our wills and our advance directives, making sure that we talk about death in a real way with our families. Don't skirt around the issue and think that, we shouldn't talk about death. I've been to people's bedsides as they're dying, and the family members will say, we're not talking about death right now. don't mention it. As though by not mentioning it, not talking about it, somehow it's going to go away. And the person's probably going to die. It's so much better to go ahead and face, for the dead person, or the person who's dying, it's better for them. Focus them on the right things. And then for the living also, it's so much better to realize that you're working towards death than to be in denial and then finally have to face the reality and then have an emotional crash. Right? So we talk in an honest way, speak about death as a reality, not if I die, then this is what you should do, but when I die, this is what you should do. When I die, these are the values that we have Islamically. I want to, please make sure that you remember these things. Memorize these du'as. Put an app together. Those who can design apps, put an app together. Put a book together that is a handbook for death, a death handbook. Right? So everyone has it handy. You have an app on your phone. So as soon as you're in this situation, you know where to go for the du'as, for the procedures and these kinds of things. Because it's a high stress situation. It's hard to remember things if they're not already second nature and they're not near at hand and easy to access. Put in your advanced directives. Think about the situations that could arise and what you want to be done when you are no longer conscious and you're no longer in a position to make decisions. Right? Make sure you talk to your spouses and you talk to your children and let them know that you're not eager to continue living in that sort of a situation. I'd much rather die with you holding my hands and reading du'as to me than to have tubes down my throat and hooked up to all these different things and doctors all surrounding me and machines all surrounding me and no human being, no loved one around me and no mention of Allah near me. That's much scarier for me. I'd rather be with you and hear the Qur'an and hear du'as recited as I'm dying. That's what's important to me. Right? Okay, recite with salawat, please. I've lost track of time. Who's keeping track of time? We started at 7:15? Okay, so let's go ahead and close that. Inshallah, there are a couple of more areas I want to talk about in terms of priorities. I was thinking we'd get to them today, but this part of it went a little longer. But it's important. I think whatever we can do to think about these things, it can really change our way of thinking, and then it'll affect our lives in a real way if we take this to heart and make some adjustments in our lives and in our deaths. Right, for the purpose of this. I want to read a short excerpt from, again, the aftermath of Karbala. This story, like yesterday's, also takes place in the court of Yazid after the prisoners are brought to him in Damascus. Yazid had Imam al-Husayn's head placed before him. He began knocking with his staff on al-Husayn's teeth, saying, "A day for a day. This day for the day of Badr." There's a famous poem that he recites at this time. The poem has an interesting story. It's originally written by a person named Abdullah ibn Ziba'ra. So Abdullah ibn Ziba'ra was one of the staunch opponents of the Prophet. He was on the battlefield of Uhud on the Mushrikeen side, and he was also a poet. So Badr happened in the second year of Hijrah, and then the following year was Uhud, which was seen by the Mushrikeen as payback for Badr. They had lost many of their elders, Abu Jahl and Hind's father and brother, and prominent people. Even Lady Khadija, one of her brothers, was on the side of the Mushrikeen. He was killed. Imam Ali had killed most of them. And so they were on the battlefield with all of their women crying and reciting poetry to goad the men on. They had, the way we recite poetry and remember Imam Hussein and think of the emotion that we get into, thinking of revenge and thinking of sadness and these kinds of things. So this is what the Mushrikeen were also promoting on their side, getting the women to recite poetry and eulogize and really goad on the soldiers. And so when they first seem like they're losing, and then because of Khalid bin Walid, they end up winning against the Muslims. They gloat and they say, "A day for a day, like this day for the day of Badr." So Ibn Ziba'ra, he recites this poem that Yazid later co-opts. He takes the same poem, makes adjustments, puts his own name in certain key phrases, and he recites this poem at this time, when the prisoners come in his court, and he is now gloating at his victory over the Banu Hashim, just as Ibn Zabara had gloated over his victory over the Prophet. Would that my ancestors from Badr could witness the grief of the Khazraj when our spears struck. So Khazraj refers to the Medinans. And Khazraj is the major tribe. They're 3-1, they outnumbered the Aus. And so when they say Khazraj, they mean the Medinans, which in this case means the Muslims. The Muslims, the Prophet, these kinds of... Yazid's saying this now. Okay, our victory over the Muslims. Right? Think where that puts him on the spectrum. Would that my ancestors from Badr could witness the grief of the Khazraj when our spears struck. They would cheer and howl in jubilation and then say, Yazid, may you never fail. We've killed the foremost of their champions and repaid him for Badr, so it's settled. The Hashemites but dabbled in power. No prophecy was given, no scripture revealed. I am no son of Khindif if I don't take revenge on the progeny of Ahmad for what he once did. Right, so Karbala was payback for Yazid. He felt like this is just revenge against the Prophet for having killed his grandfather and his great-grandfather and his great-uncle. Right, this was revenge for him. Abu Barzat al-Aslami announced, I testified that I saw the Prophet kiss those lips and the lips of his brother Al-Hasan as he said, you two are the masters of heaven's youth. May God destroy those who will murder you. May He damn them and stoke hellfire for them. What a terrible place to end up. Yazid became infuriated at this and had him dragged out of his court. A messenger from the Byzantine emperor who was there told Yazid, on one island we have one hoof from Jesus' mule. Every year from all over our people make pilgrimages to visit it. They bring their vows and honor it the way you honor your books. Right? So think of that culture as Christian, a Byzantine Christian coming into the court, seeing this being done with the progeny of the Prophet, and with his sensibilities as a Christian, he says, this doesn't make any sense. We, the hoof of a mule that's supposedly ridden by Jesus once. That hoof we have on this island, and everyone comes as pilgrims to come and visit that hoof. Because of that connection, so many times removed, through a mule, connection to Jesus makes it so special to us. And we come and bring our nadhr and these kinds of things. We make our oaths in front of this to try to connect with Isa and connect with Allah through this. Right? And now look what you're doing. And look at today's Yazid and what they do with also the relics. And Yazid's doing this to Imam Hussein's head, right? But now we have similar things being done with the relics in Medina, Baqi, and these places. You know, connections are destroyed, things are razed to the ground. Memory is they're trying to wipe it out, so we have no connection left to the Prophet. Right? So he says, however, after seeing you treat the grandson of your Prophet, I hereby testify that you are evil. This Christian declares Yazid as evil and calls him on this. This made Yazid angry, and he ordered that the messenger be executed. The messenger leapt toward the head of Hussein and kissed it and uttered the declaration of faith. When he was executed, those who were gathered distinctly heard a voice from Imam Hussein's head saying, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-aliy al-azim. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdillah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bifina'ik. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Allah, help us to increase in knowledge and in faith and in righteousness. Forgive us for all of our shortcomings and our sins. Allah, help us to learn from the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt and to emulate them in our lives. Help us to do things in a meaningful and a thoughtful way, always trying to please you and always trying to avoid displeasing you. Allow us to avail ourselves of the intercession of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt. Allow us to die in a way that is dignified. We ask you to let us live our lives as Muhammad and the family of Muhammad lived, and to let us die the way they died. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين.